Eileen Joyce made her reputation in England in a big way during the war, playing the popular concertos the length and breadth of the country, playing in factories, theatres and concert halls. One-night stands, sometimes twice nightly. Later, she made many tours in many countries. Miss Joyce, when did music first hit you out in the wilds of Tasmania?
Very difficult to answer that because one doesn't realise over here how very primitive it is and the sort of primitive atmosphere I was brought up in. The early part of my life we were sort of intense, and later my father moved to the goldfields, that's Boulder City, where we lived in a sort of shack. My uncle owned a pub on the goldfields, a very tough pub. Now in his pub he had a very old piano, and somehow or other I got to know about it and sneaked in and used to begin to sort of play a little. Well, eventually my father bought it for a few pounds and wheeled it home. Well, then I went to the local convent school, and I found there that the nuns taught music. And of course that fascinated me, and I begged my mother to pay the 6 a week to learn. In those days I used to get up very early and practice, rush home from school. I just couldn't stop. It hypnotized me. And eventually little examinations used to take place, you know, and gradually I went in for higher examinations. And eventually the priest wrote to the Loretto Convent in Perth and said, "We have a very clever little girl here. Would you take her and educate her?" And there I stayed for 2 years, still practicing very hard and going along with my education. And then Percy Granger came out to play in Perth and gave some concerts. And he allowed people to go and watch him practice, which was very interesting. And of course I went and listened the whole time and also to the concerts. Then he came to the convent to play for the nuns, and they said, "Oh, would you hear a clever little girl that we have here?" So along I was brought to play. And he didn't say anything, but he wrote a letter to the papers saying that I consider this little girl should be sent away to study. It's a very big talent, and I think the people of Perth should send her away. Well, about 6 weeks later, Backhouse came, and he came out to play for the nuns. And again they said, "We have a very clever little girl. Will you hear her play?" Oh, yes, I played. And he said, "Well, she has great talent, but she should go to Leipzig to study."
Oh,
anyhow, to Leipzig I was sent.
At the age of what?
I should think I was about 15. The nuns packed for me and they sent me off, and I was met in London by the Agent General for West Australia, and he took me over as far as Leipzig and left me there, where I studied with Max Power. Now, Max Power gave master classes with about 12 or 15 students. Well, of course, I wasn't advanced enough for that. I didn't know how to learn a concerto or any work at all. I just had very little learning indeed, except Backhouse and Percy Granger must have thought whatever I played to them, they saw something in me. And I think I was with him about 9 months, and suddenly one night I was very lonely, and I was late for a concert, and I saw my Professor Max Power talking to 2 people. And apparently he said to them, "Oh, over there is a lonely little Australian. Would you take her to your heart and look after her? Because I'm sure she's lonely." Now that was Mr. and Mrs. Andre, who were there. Mrs. Andre had studied in Leipzig years before and had come back on her honeymoon. They were New Zealanders, just to see the place and to show her husband. So I went over to them, and Max Power introduced me, and they looked after me. And really, Mrs. Andre took me to her heart. Now, her first reaction was, "You're not advanced enough for the classes of Max Power. You ought to go to Teichmüller." Actually, this caused a rather nasty sensation at the time, because Max Power was very upset. I was taken along to Teichmüller to play, and I broke one of his strings of the piano. I had this is the Schlerzer etude that I'd learnt with Max Power. etude in A flat, so I played this. He said, this is absolutely wonderful. So I stayed with Teichmüller for 2 years and learnt my Prokofiev concerto, my Chopin concerto, and the Andres always retained interest in me in England, and they eventually said, well, it's time you went to live in London, so they found me a room and got me a Blüthner piano, and that was the moment I started out on my own.
Mm. How about recordings? How did you come to make your first recording?
Well, I wrote round to everybody and said, could I come and make a record? And they wrote back and said, no, we've never heard of you. And there was a pianist called Carol Schrater who recorded for Parlophone in those days. And I think he must have put the suggestion into my head, because I wrote to Parlophone then and said, how much does it cost to make a record? And they wrote back and said £7.10. I said, well, I've got £7.10, will you book me the studio? Which they did, and along I went. And I think they gave me my first little tryout. And the technician said, but you're wonderful. And Mr. Preuss came in very haughty and said, oh, that sounds very good.
What did you
And
play?
I'll ring you up in a week's time.
Mm-hmm.
So I made the list, F minor etude. Well, the following week, Mr. Preuss rang and said, will you come along and hear your record? And I said, yes. So when I got along, he was there with about 3 other men, and he put it on. And after it was finished, he said, well, what do you think of that? And I said, well, I think it's wonderful. He said, well, so do we. We're not going to let you pay us £7.10. We're going to pay you. Well, then they said, come along and make the other side. And it was the Schletzer etude that I made, that I had studied with Max Power and broke Teichmüller's piano string with it. So I made that, and that came out, and that's when Christopher Stone made it the record of the month.
Do you like any of your gramophone records? Most artists hate their own records. I just wondered.
I think I was amazed at the first one when I met Mr. Preuss, and he said, listen to this, because if you remember, that was the first time I'd ever heard myself. I had no idea how I played or what my finger technique was. And I came from Leipzig at that moment with sort of racehorse fingers, you know what I mean? And they really were perfection. And that was, I think, a very good record.
But I remember Rubinstein saying that he liked his records for a month, and then he got fed up because he'd found he'd moved on and the records hadn't.
Yes, but I think that with me, when I look back on all my performances, it's very rare that I could say to myself after the performance, oh, that was wonderful. But of course you can't always tell people that, because for one thing they won't believe you and it depresses them. But I think it is a point, because if you thought too much about what you had done the night before, how you'd played, and you dwelled too much on the mistakes that, or in interpretation, or that you could have done this better, you'd kill yourself. You must have a philosophy and say, I did my best, and that was the best I could do. And then you must forget it and then go on to your next work. Otherwise you just die.